Hello, everyone, and welcome today. I'm really excited to welcome you to the fourth week of our International Disability Law Summer School on Article 30. I'm briefly going to audio describe myself, and then I will introduce the session before inviting our esteemed panelists to audio describe themselves and briefly introduce themselves. So my name is Maria Nilartha. I am a white relatively short woman with a long, slightly messy brown hair. I'm very speckly, and I'm sitting in front of a couple of bookcases with both a pride flag, but also crucially for this session, the flag of the rugby team, which I support, Connacht Rugby, our local team in Galway. I'm delighted to welcome you here. I have been reliably informed by Eli that it is International Olympic Day, which is very fitting. And I would love to pretend that as we were trying to work out how to engage with all of these issues over summer school, that we had deliberately placed our sports panel today, but that is actually just a wonderful coincidence. I should also say that while our panel are incredibly esteemed and qualified in the world of sport, I myself am simply an observer and a real enthusiast, which is why I have elbowed everyone out of the way today in order to be able to facilitate a conversation I've wanted to have in summer school for a really, really long time. As a disabled person growing up, sport wasn't something I was particularly fond of. Actually, I think it's probably a site of a lot of childhood anxiety. But as an adult, I rediscovered sport through a community lens, through a supporter lens, and it's become a really important part of my life. But I think these conversations around sport, around what bodies can and participate, around what sport means for us in our community, is so important. Over the last few weeks, we've heard so many references to the Paralympics, to shows like The Last Leg, to various different other ways. And it's been about more than Article 30. A lot of the time it's been about breaking down barriers, making the world more accessible, challenging perceptions of disability in a really meaningful way. In our own context here in Ireland, sport and cross-community sport has been a tool of development and peace building, and has been able to reach communities in ways very few other things have. I should also say that while this is the Disability Law Summer School, none of these conversations happen in a vacuum, and we need to be kind of facilitate space to have conversations across human rights and equality spaces, which is why I'm so glad that Peoshni is joining us today, in particular to talk about some of the difficulties facing intersex athletes, because what sport does for our society, for our communities, what it means to ensure that that is reflective of kind of equality and the values that we all share, is so important. So that is kind of my slightly emotional for me spiel on why I'm very excited to be here. Now I'm going to just ask Eli if you want to come on and introduce yourself and audio describe yourself, and then Peoshni and Dominique.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's really honored to be a part of this conversation today and to be with all of you. My name's Eli. I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a white male. I have dark hair. I'm sitting actually in my basement. And behind me is a Peloton, which I think is the symbol of COVID reality for some of us. My background has been over many years, about 20 years now, of working on disability, inclusion, and human rights in the sport, recreation, physical activity, physical education, and play space, and have really recognized the opportunity for disability to be included into the broader human rights and sport for development conversations. And I had the honor of being included through Professor Janet Lord and Professor Stein and many others to engage with many folks. I know Amy Farkas has been a part of this, and many others here today, to work on Article 30 and the drafting, particularly of Article 30.5. And that process really inspired and engaged me and got me to recognize and realize the power of sport in a broad sense, but also this reaction, I think, that was shared about, the wrongs of sport, or the sport as it presents challenges, and how do we create sport in a way that can be safe and inclusive and empowering. And I guess the final point that I'd like to make is, I've also been really quite involved with the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, which is on April 6th of each year, and being involved with this broader sport for development and sport and human rights movement. So although, my work and passion is around disability, it is very much in the broader conversation of human rights and sport. So again, it's great to be here with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Peyoshni.
Thank you, Maria. I'm really glad to be part of this exciting panel, and I hope I can make some contributions which are worthy enough. I would like to first sort of introduce myself. I'm Peyoshni Mitra. I am an Indian woman in my 40s, and I'm wearing black, and I have very kind of thick white glasses that I wear. So I identify as an athlete's rights activist myself. I have played badminton as a young woman growing up in India, and did face discrimination and harassment as I was playing badminton. And it kind of led me to my work on gender issues in sport, which wasn't something that people were sort of doing in India at that point when I was planned to do my PhD. And gradually I moved on to work with women athletes who had high level of testosterone. Maria, you just said intersex athletes. Well, some of them identify as intersex, but many of them do not identify as intersex. Women, so I would like to stick to saying women with high testosterone. And that has been what I have been doing in the last 12 years. And some of the more sort of popular cases that I have been associated with are cases of Dutee Chand, an Indian athlete who challenged a regulation, the hyperandrogenism regulations of the International Association for International Association of Athletics Federations, IAAF, now called World Athletics. And later on, I was also one of the experts who testified at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Castro Semenian's case. And I continue to do this work at this point. A lot is going on. This is quite a big debate, as many of you are aware. And many of the international federations are finally listening to us, at least trying to listen to us. So that's what I have been involved with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're delighted to have you. Dominique, would you like to come on and describe yourself and tell us a bit about yourself? Okay, so with that, we might launch into the first question, and hopefully Dominique will be back with us shortly. But the first question that we'd initially identified, which are, what do you think are the priority areas for sports and human rights? And the first person that was directed at was Peyoshni.
Thank you, Maria. It's so different, on Zoom, where you have to switch on the microphone and switch it off. Anyways, I'm Peyoshni, and I'm talking about, the question that Maria just asked about sport and human rights. Well, I'm so glad that we are having these debates and discussion today on human rights in sports, because for the longest time, we know that issues connected related to human rights in sports were not really discussed. Sports seem to be this terrain which is so separate from the rest of the society, which is not true, clearly, because sport is very much part of the society, and it was so important to discuss these issues. Now, in the context of India, where I have spent the majority of my time and worked, it seemed to me that in sports, what is so essential is the talk, is the right of the athlete. Because when you talk about high performance sport, what happens is the athlete kind of stops being a human, but is looked at as a medium to probably winning more medals for the country. So sport is not necessarily for the benefit of the athlete, but sport becomes something that is for the benefit of the nation, for the benefit of the game itself, but not necessarily the athlete. So it's very important to bring back the power to the athlete. And I think that is something that we are seeing a lot these days, given some of our top athletes across the world are speaking out against several kind of discrimination. We have young women athletes like Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles, they are just opening up, talking. Dutee Chand from India, so we see this a lot now, but I think we need to see that a lot more, because sport has a culture of subservience. Sport has a culture which is so hierarchical that it's really difficult for athletes to sort of speak out, challenge any kind of violation that takes place. I think that's where the key focus is today in the world of sport, sort of bringing back the power of the athlete to the athlete rather than, and not to the system around the athlete. So I think, obviously we can talk about other issues, for example, in violations of human rights in the context of sport, whether there is remedy systems available to athletes and all of that. But I think I will stop there and let other speakers speak as well.
No, that was brilliant, and I think that idea of hardship is so very, very prevalent, particularly like across Article 30 in terms of the arts and what it means to have a true vocation and to kind of that you have to sacrifice for it. But I think particularly when like national pride is possibly attached and those other things that we ascribe to sport, it can accelerate even more. The same, Eli, what are your thoughts in terms of the priority areas for sport and human rights?
Yeah, no, that's good. No, thank you for those comments to start us off were really good, and kind of thinking about the athlete voice. Actually, later this week, over the last several years, I've worked with the Muhammad Ali Center, and we've organized the Athletes and Social Change Initiative to really think about and promote that athlete voice, and particularly Muhammad Ali's legacy on sport and human rights. As we're seeing this momentum grow both globally and then also here in the United States, it's really important to see that. And I think there is a lot of, interesting dynamics, and particularly as it relates to coming up for the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, there's just a really important opportunity to recognize where athletes can have their voice and their rights, and how that can get translated into real time, and what that really means, both on the field, off the field, and so forth. I also think in terms of how do we really ensure that disability gets included into the human rights and sport conversation. Although we do have Article 30, Article 30.5, there's still kind of this when major organizations and groups and stakeholders are looking at the sport and human rights conversations, are looking at social justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion, disability is sometimes not included into that conversation still. And so I think that needs to continue to be worked on. We need to still have, train and work to engage kind of this next generation, but also getting more stakeholders into the boardrooms and at the table. We need to ensure that policies are inclusive, that universal design is really implemented throughout. So from all levels, not only on the playing field, but in terms of whether it's the employment side of things, the fan experience, the stadium. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be integrated into the sport and human rights and social justice conversations to ensure that disability is really in there. I mean, even here we are with Olympic Day, and if you look at the Olympic Charter, disability is not included in the non-discrimination statements and so forth. So I think it's, even at the language level, but also just in terms of overall how it's implemented in terms of moving that forward. But I do think the way we are able to educate and train and really build out this next generation, I think it's been quite interesting to see, there's a lot more vocal voices and empowered young athletes and stakeholders and leaders moving forward, particularly around race, gender, LGBTQ+, other areas. But disability is still not quite there yet. If you kind of look at a curve of the momentum building on these human rights issues, disability just has not quite gotten there. And so I think the more that we're able to bring these conversations forward and to recognize that sport, recreation, and play are really a part of these, sometimes it gets left out. Like we don't see this as an essential area. The human condition includes this area. And so I think the more that we can engage that is very important.
Hello. Hi.
Wonderful to have you, and apologies for that, those technical difficulties. I will ask you if you could introduce yourself and your work, and then maybe we can also get some of your feelings on some of the sports inequality issues of that question.
Yeah, sorry, I have an issue with internet, so that's why I didn't catch up with you. So my name is Dominic Bizimana. I'm from Rwanda. I'm married with 3 daughters. Yeah, I did education, especially French, and I had also an opportunity to do masters in sports management with Olympic Committee. So currently, I am the chairperson of National Union Disability Organization in Rwanda. This is the umbrella of all type of disability organization in Rwanda. Yeah, I joined NUDO, National Union Disability Organization, in 2013. But before to be the president of NIDO, I have to be part of one organization, member of NIDO. So my background is with Paralympic. I'm the founder of National Paralympic Committee of Rwanda in 2000. So since that time, I was involved really in sports, especially at African level. Even actually, I'm still in charge of development of sports in Africa, and also I'm chairperson of East African Paralympic Committee. Yeah, my current job, actually, I'm sales representative of Otobok. Otobok in sports Paralympic is in charge of all prostheses and orthosis. So I'm in charge of sales in West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa. So I have opportunity, to attend different international competition because I'm also an athlete especially in sitting volleyball. We're the first sub-Saharan country in a sub-Saharan country to participate in the Paralympic Games in 2012 in London. So I'm really proud to be also Paralympian because I have participated in the Paralympic Games as a captain. So my really area of working is disability movement. Yeah, thank you.
And just to kind of jump straight onto the second question for you, what do you think kind of the priority areas are in terms of sport and human rights from like a disability perspective and equality perspective?
Yeah, as you may know, all sports play an important role in especially for person with disability. I will be talking in especially my experience in sports and the human rights. Sports has a role in society and for promoting human rights and social integration. For instance, in Rwanda, we use sports as a tool for social integration. Yeah, after 1994 genocide, where we really had bad time. So to bring together people, we have to use sports. Especially we as a Paralympian, we had athletes who used to fight during the war. So by end of the genocide in 1994 genocide, we have to brought together all people were fighting, and we make up a team sport, especially sitting volleyball. So for us, this is one or two of social integration and sports and its principle of respect and fair play. With sport we can unite people across borders and we can bridge social, cultural, and economic divides. Sports also can teach us valuable lessons about non-discrimination and inclusivity, especially as a person with disability. We need to be included in all type or life of as others people. Sport also can challenge stereotypes, which help users to break down barriers in society and drive progress and on lessons on issues. Where there are still issues that impact like enjoyment of human rights of those involved in sports at every level, from athlete and fan to work and the media, especially as we Paralympian, we still facing some challenges, especially in the accessibility, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of communication. Yeah, those are still challenges that we are facing, to enjoy the human rights, especially in sports.
Amazing. Thank you. That was, again, I think just the amount of issues that we've kind of covered just in that initial question kind of sets quite the scope of this panel. For our next question, Eli, and again, everything is phrased quite broadly to allow everyone to speak to their specific knowledge and context. What are the difficulties around the criteria for who gets to take part in sport in your specific context and how that's applied?
Can you just, the question is particularly around the categories or?
Around categories and
Yeah. Okay.
How we kind of define and use very specific categories to determine, I suppose, where people should be playing sport, and it can kind of touch on any of those broad issues.
Yeah, no, I think that, an important element and aspect of inclusivity and adaptive and the whole realm of people with disabilities in sport is the fact that people with disabilities can be, depending on the disability, invisible, visible, can be involved in different types of settings and different types of, competitions or events, or, it depends on the level and so forth. And so the categories that are created or established in the same ways that we have like weight classes, or the same ways that we have in other sports, you think about categorization. And so part of that within the disability sport movement is creating, categories of around disability, or around, some of them are factor system, where, some sports have different systems to actually look at creating equity and inclusion. And sometimes it's not a perfect science, sometimes it's still being worked on to try to create the best way to create a fairness within the sports. And so I think that part of that is quite interesting to see the evolution of that and to see the politics and to see the rights and to see how can we really create fair and equitable categories. Because part of it is that, for people with disabilities, you can be, like from my experience, as an athlete, I competed in sports with people without disabilities, as well as competitions with people with disabilities. So you kind of have both and many different types of categories and experiences. And so I think that's part of it, is to kind of take the individual athlete and to see what makes sense, and then to recognize how do you create, systems around that, or how do you create policy, or how do you then, look at the aggregate of what is going to be the best, appropriate approach to that sport. So yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the challenges that often presents itself around disability and inclusion, but it's not alone to disability. You see it across the board in terms of other types of sports, in terms of particularly around gender, and so I think that's part of the interesting aspect of it. But I do think it's interesting because oftentimes we think of, people with disabilities have to fit into an able-bodied event or system, but recognizing that the categories of disability is just as legitimate and just as fair. And so I think that's a big educational moment, to get people to realize that we're not just trying to get people with disabilities into a team with other people without disabilities all the time, that oftentimes we're trying to look at creating distinct events or categories that can be added into existing events. So take swimming. Swimming, you have an event and you can add disciplines. You can add disciplines into that. So we can definitely talk more about that. But I think that's part of the understanding, is to recognize that it's not just a one size fits all, but it's along a continuum and a spectrum, and to value those different approaches.
And to value all of that, I suppose, equally as well, and that it all gets the attention and celebration that it deserves. Piyushni, what are the difficulties, and this is very much jumping, I suppose, not quite discipline, but focusing on a very different area, around the criteria for who gets to take part in sport in your context, specifically around athletes with high T, and I suppose some of what's been imposed there?
I think it's the binary model of sport, which we need to talk about here, and how the fact that we have historically had a binary model of sport, and that kind of leads to this confusion. Now, and the other thing that we need to also, I want to talk about, is the notion that women's category is a protected category. And that is something that you would hear a lot, especially in the US. There you do hear that a lot, I believe, these days, that women's category needs to be protected because it came into being as a protected category, etc. But that's not true. I mean, if you look at the history of sport, think about athletics, for example. Women started their own athletics, and organizers of men's athletics felt that women's athletics might sort of get too popular. And that's when they are sort of agreeing to organize both men and women's sports. It was not that they wanted to protect women's category, which is why they had a separate category of women. So you would sort of hear these things, and a lot of people would feel, well, it sounds right that women's category needs to be protected. Well, that's not what historically it has been. So that is one of the things that I wanted to talk about. And this, who belong to that category of women? Who is woman enough to be part of the category of women in sport? That's the big question that we deal with today. I think especially in the US, in college, in collegiate sport, you are probably aware of the several sort of debates as far as trans women's inclusion in sport is concerned, and scholarships, and if the money involved, who is rightfully sort of a woman to access those kind of scholarships or the podium. In the context of the athletes that I have been working with in the last 12, 13 years, it's a different issue in the sense that I work with women who were assigned female sex at birth, who reared up as girls, identified all their lives as girls and women, and have competed as girls and women all their lives, and want to continue to be competing as women as well. These are women who have high level of testosterone. Policies vary from one sport to another. Earlier, there was something called sex testing policies or gender verification. Then at some point, our sport organizers started believing that, gender cannot be determined. What the world thinks today, sport organizers think way in the future. So sport doesn't really go along with how progressively the rest of the world thinks. Sport doesn't listen to them as much. So we had the hyperandrogenism regulations, which came into being in 2011 after Caster Semenia's case was huge in 2009 World Championships in Berlin, and that kind of brought people's attention to this idea of women can have high level of androgen or high level of testosterone, and for the first time, they at least tried on paper to take away the focus from one's gender to something which is quote unquote kind of medical, because we're talking about testosterone. And then now IAAF has kind of a classification, they call it female eligibility classification, which is about differences of sex development. And to be fair, it's World Athletics who have these, but then not all sports federations have it. And the International Olympic Committee, who have often aligned their position with World Athletics in the past, is finally probably moving towards a different direction, because we are aware of some of the press releases and also their very recent human rights strategy recommendations published by the IOC on their website in December 2020, which kind of tells us that probably the focus is moving from the body, trying to sort of determine someone's sex or gender, trying to determine how much testosterone, or trying to determine whether someone has competitive advantage, to a notion of human rights, to the notion of inclusivity. So I feel that there is probably a shift happening there at the IOC, and I'm hopeful that some of the other federations will also follow that position once we are aware, we know what the final IOC position is. So we are seeing all these different kinds of reaction at the international level, and that complicates the situation for athletes. Now, the athletes I work with, most of them identify as women, while a couple of them, and you may have seen that Margaret Wambui from Kenya very recently in an interview given to BBC mentioned that if she's allowed to compete in a third category, she's okay with that as well. But then Caster Semenya doesn't want to do that. Francine Niyonsaba doesn't want to do that. So there are obviously, there are diversity of opinion even there among athletes themselves. But it is a huge debate. While I have been working on this, I do feel that women's sport actually has so many different issues. I mean, we're still fighting for equal money. We are still fighting for equal access across the world at different levels, whether it is high performance or at the recreational level. Women's sport has so many problems. We are facing discrimination, sexual harassment, and we know how bad sport could be just because of its hierarchical sort of structure as far as sexual harassment cases are concerned. And we are not talking about them. We are focusing on something like this, creating a category of woman which is perfect, whereas we don't have enough scientific data or research to support that kind of a category, that they're trying to create. So I think it's extremely important that international organizations understand this and understand the idea of competitive advantage, redefine the idea of competitive advantage, try to break that and understand that, and try to think how they can redefine that, rather than sort of blame people for for having certain traits, and say that you can't compete as women. I don't know, Maria, if it answers your question, but I hope it sort of leads to some more further discussion.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think one of the things that really struck out there is athletes' response around, particularly around the Caster Semenya case, where women athletes were going, we're facing so many issues and there's so much inequality in terms of sport. Why is this the issue you people are focusing on? We're broke, we're underfunded, we're really struggling to compete on an equal basis. Yet this is the issue that gained so much traction, whereas like the women's soccer team in the US, who are the only good soccer team America has, are paid less, which should realistically be the controversial issue. Dominique, for you again, the same question: what are the difficulties around criteria for who gets to take part in sport in your context?
Yeah, I think, depend on we in the disability movement, in sports movement, so criteria depend on type of disability. So for instance, for blind, we find that they are different from those who are physical, those who are mental. So it depends. And also each type of disability has its challenge, and also, yeah, for instance, and also it depends also on the equipment, adequate facilities. So we are, criteria depend on type of disability who will be take parts, and as you know, disability is a cross-cutting issue. So we can vote like who want to take part in a soccer, they will be facing like a blind, they they have to first of even to manage, to change the laws of soccer so that they can play the football like others who have disability. And also in disability come also a kind of classification depend on your type of disability. So those are those issues. For instance, in standing volleyball, you find that depend on people who will take part in this sport. We have to know that if you like, for me, I don't have a leg, so I have to use a prosthesis. So it will depend also on the other part who lose his arm. He has also to those issues of classification. It's always criteria to take part, and also depend on type of disability. For mental, as I say, for physical challenge, they will you need to all bring together, and also coming again, the technologies, and also sports has also in the learning, in the athletics, you can just go and run without appropriate prosthesis. So those are challenges. That's when you are looking on those issues of criteria who will take part as a coach, as an administrator, as a athlete, you need to look and also you need also to find the way, to make sure that inclusiveness, it will also depend on means. For instance, those who are, those who are developing countries, they're also facing, those issues of how, to reach the high level, how they need, the high coaches and also high technology and the accessibility in the infrastructure. So those are also the criteria and also issues that you need to look at when you want to be involved you want to take part in sports.
Amazing. I think we have time for just one more question before we go to the break, and then we'll come back for the final question. And again, this could be a fairly long question. And starting with Dominique, how do decisions that are made at an international level around particularly elite athletes impact how other people engage, or how other people engage in sport, and how people at, I suppose, all levels engage in sport, not just at that international level?
Yeah, some international decision can affect athletes, like for us in the Paralympic, as I say, this issue of classification. When there is a new law about classification, you can find that, one athlete who was in one class be somehow disadvantaged because you are taken to another class. So prior your competition, so those are issues that can affect. And also when it's come also international participation in international competition, where you find that there's a new rule about like a classification and also participation criteria, when at even the costs or to participate, especially for players who are developing countries, we find that sometimes we are somehow affected by participation criteria, costs. If you want to travel, for a competition, and it is a classification, and you cannot, find also the money, to travel. So this is also a thing that it can affect. But we, especially in the Paralympic, we always affected by those, especially in the classification, new rules, and also sometimes also political decision can affect you also. When I think that there is a sanction about a country who didn't abide for international rules, so you find that even athletes can sometimes coming from this country can be affected. Yes.
Amazing. And Eli, you're up next. How do decisions that are made at an international level around elite athletes impact how, I suppose, other people engage in sport?
Yeah, just to follow, I'm not sure I have much more to add from Dominique. But I do think that, clearly the investments and, the prioritization sometimes around the elite athletes and national teams and the influence that makes and how that impacts kind of the broader investments. I know there's oftentimes these debates and discussions around, should we have, the awards money that goes for medals for the Paralympians or for other athletes, rather than that money that could be distributed, more broadly out into the development pipeline. But also, could that money that goes to recognize these elite athletes at the same level, perhaps as the Olympians or other world champion levels, does that then actually help to inspire a broader investment at the grassroots? So I think there is kind of a chicken and the egg, or trying to figure out what would be a good strategy, and oftentimes different organizations approach it in different ways. In 2019, the United States Olympic Committee, and then it evolved just in the last couple of years to the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. But but also they made the decision to actually make equal pay for Olympians and Paralympians in terms of their award winnings coming out of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And so that, was a huge decision. That kind of equity had never been established before. In my time, many of my peers' times of competing, there were not, I think it was a 1/4 or 1/3 distribution rather than a parity or, full equity. So that, definitely made international news, for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee to make that decision. They also changed the name. It's now the Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So I think that, that decision to make that kind of investment at the elite level, that kind of trickle effect down. And so you're actually now seeing national federations, grassroots. So, that's an example of perhaps seeing that that strategy could have a trickle down effect. But there's still, folks and many that have said, well, why that money, perhaps could be redirected, and thinking about all the money that's invested into the elite athletes, that can really be put down. Even in the last year or so, there's been a national strategy around youth sports, and just in the writing of the documents, for a number of the drafts of it, there was no disability in there. So, we kind of made sure that disability gets put into that, national youth sports strategy. And so to these different levels of kind of recognizing these investments at both the elite level and also the grassroots. But just some examples to bring some light to that.
Thank you. And I think we're seeing that in gender and sport as well, like which comes first, like sport at that grassroots or professionalization is probably the biggest debate in Irish women's rugby right now. Peoshni, for you, how do these decisions that are made around at an international level around elite athletes impact how I suppose other people get to engage in sport?
Is that a question that has come?
That's just for you.
Okay. Okay. So I wanted to add to what we were discussing, because when it comes to, as you said, when it comes to women, even within disability sport, they are further discriminated, and I have seen that happening in India, where the little amount of money that comes to disability sport is also sort of channelized towards men's sport and not as much to women's. Having said that, I think there's one other point that needs to be raised here, and that is the Eurocentricity of sport governance. And how that has an impact on how sport in the global south is being understood, how the challenges in sport in the global south are understood by the people who are governing sport in mostly sort of in Europe. And I think that has an impact on all kinds of issues that we are trying to discuss today, whether it be only gender, whether it be disability sport, whether it be women in disability sport. I think it does have an impact, the fact that sport has historically and even today been extremely Eurocentric in the way it has been governed until today. It has obviously caused a lot of issues. I mean, we have been trying to raise, the concerns about women athletes with high testosterone from the global south, how their experiences have been, how difficult it is, and how national bodies who are so less connected to the international federations do very little to sort of educate the national bodies, the people who are implementing these policies. So those are also, I think, issues that we need to talk about, because on paper you will see a lot of international federations are saying great things, but are they doing enough to ensure that national bodies, their national federations, are sort of aware about these great things that they say on paper at the international stage. And sometimes they don't say great things, like in the case of DSD regulations. I don't think they're doing a great job there, World Athletics. And in that case, it also has an extremely negative impact at the national level. And these policies also has an impact outside high performance sport. When you're trying to sort of focus on difference, when you're trying to sort of identify which woman is not woman enough, that is not only in high performance sport, that has an impact beyond high performance sport at the recreational level, and also beyond sport, really, at the larger society, because often sports stars are huge. Caster Semenya is huge in Africa and also in different parts of other parts of the world. I mean, the fact that she has been facing this has an impact beyond sport. On all women who may look slightly different from how you expect them to look. And also this lens is such a Eurocentric lens. What is an ideal woman? How should a woman look? Ask those people at the medical commission in these federations and see what you hear from them. So I think these are also questions that we need to raise. And again, I probably just digressed from what you asked me, Maria, but these are points I just wanted to really badly talk about.
They're so important. I would say Caster Semenya is an icon wherever she goes at this point, and does have, like, again, just this impact of where sport just ripples and has this magnifying effect that goes far beyond the pitch or the track. We're going to take a 10-minute break now, just so people can get a drink of water, go to the loo, move, stim, whatever you need to do yourselves. And we'll be back with some of the last questions. You guys can probably see, and you guys are probably aware of at this point, we have a question and answers box. If you guys want to start getting we already have some really great questions in. If you want to start getting your questions in over the break, if the box doesn't work for you, raise your hand and a member of the CDLP team will make sure that you'll be able to ask your question by asking your question. So I'd say we'll be back around 3 or 4 minutes past 3. So go take a break, and thank you for a really interesting first half. I am ready to go, and we just have one question left from kind of the pre-scripted questions, and then we might take some kind of reflections, or take this opportunity if people have things they want to share, kind of just as we've gone through the questions more broadly, and then we'll be getting into the participants' questions. So if you have questions, do post them in the chat. So for this kind of final question, I suppose we're slightly moving away from the elite athlete space and recognizing that sport is about more than championships and trophies, and often plays really important roles, particularly for children and young people with disabilities, as Robert Martin spoke about. I say earlier in this week, he recorded it last month, but as was spoken about in the pre-recorded panel for this week. So with that in mind, the final pre-prepared question for this week, which we'll direct at Eli first, is how do we ensure that sport is for everyone? In 5 minutes or less.
That's really good question, especially when you start looking at the kind of sport for all level and young people and getting everyone engaged, and particularly in terms of participating, where young people with and without disabilities are, together in different settings, are doing adaptive settings, are kind of involved in different ways. And I guess the one area that I would want to highlight is just around being solution oriented, around being proactive, around, coming at it from a place of inclusion rather than exclusion. And really having that mindset of we can figure this out, and not getting overwhelmed by kind of stigma and, the stereotypes, and kind of recognizing, disability means that you can't be included or on the sidelines. And so I think all of that really connects to the concepts of education and kind of awareness building and getting more administrators, sport administrators, coaches, leaders to kind of have that aha moment or that like mental paradigm shift of kind of shifting your perspective. Sometimes I say, putting on that pair of glasses of inclusion. I really think that's the key, honestly, is kind of a mindset. Clearly, the mindset impacts the whole other aspects of, both physical barriers, information communication, policy, I think, but it's all wrapped up into kind of being able to click in and recognize that this can be a solution. So, oftentimes almost every week, I'm contacted, approached with a problem or a challenge, or, this coach is not allowing my child, or this organization that doesn't have an inclusive policy, or, there's, and really it's about how do you get people in the room to really just solve the problem and create an opportunity. And so I think I'll stop there. I mean, I'm happy to follow up with other thoughts, but I think that to me, that's a big one.
Really important stuff there. Peotni, how do we ensure that sport is for everyone? And what do we need to do to?
I wish there was, I knew the answer, Maria. I wish I knew it. But it's what we need to understand, I believe, is the diversity of the population we are talking about when it comes to sport. And certain countries, the facilities that we have there, some of the countries are so far behind as far as the ideas of equality are concerned, not only in the sector of sport but elsewhere as well. Certain cultures are so hierarchical inherently that the issues are even deeper there. And so it's really it's not something that you have one answer to. It really depends on in which context we are talking about. Are we talking about the international federations and how they can do things differently, how their policy formulation, their processes, their committees should be inclusive, so that and inclusive not as a token, but inclusive in the real sense. Yes, of course, we must talk about that, but in the context of different countries, and I'm sure Dominic will be able to talk about how it is in Rwanda, in the context of India, or in the context of several countries that are, I am working with a lot of athletes in different parts of the world, and the kind of sort of challenges they are facing are so different from the challenges faced by athletes here in the UK. I'm currently in London, so if I compare the kind of challenges that athletes in India face, athletes in disability sport even more so, and the difference is so much that there is no one answer. We are all in different stages. It's sad but true that some of the sporting nations, for example, the US is way ahead in many ways, and the women's sport movement in the US also has helped. It's been there since the 1970s. It did help in many ways to bring in, equality as far as women are concerned. I mean, for the longest time, I would say in India, feminists believe the sport is such a hyper masculine activity that it's not something that we want to engage in. So it sort of delayed the whole process of change within sport. And we are so far behind when it comes to these issues. So there is no one answer. At different level, at the local, regional, national level, we all need to sort of come together and work towards sort of more progressive options within sport. But it can't be also the same, because what one is facing in the US is not the same as what an athlete is facing in India. So yes, but at the international level, yes, as far as the international federations are concerned, we must definitely push for inclusivity. We must definitely push for equal rights, equal representation of people, from every section of the society. And I think that's going in the right direction, because there is a lot of talk at this point about about Sports Federation adopting human rights framework. And this wasn't there some time back, but now there is a Center for Sport and Human Rights, and there are sort of talks on these issues which were not there even 10 years back. So there is a movement which is positive, and we must recognize that. But we also need to recognize that we are at different stages of that sort of graph at different parts of the world.
I should unmute myself. 18 months into a pandemic, I still haven't figured it out. That again, just the I suppose the extent of the different barriers that are there, but the amount of potential for positive change and for good is so clear. Dominique, how in your opinion, how do we make sure that sport is for everyone?
Dominique, you need to unmute, sir.
Yeah, sorry. As sports is life, so everyone should practice sports. And we know also the value also those sports bring people together. So for us as a person with disability, if sports is really important for everyone with disability. So for us, sports is a therapy. I have been, I can testimony that I've been doing the sport with people who used to have crutches, but after a long practice of sports, someone, and I have one friend of mine, because of practice of sports, one day, just, threw out, his crutch, and I asked him how, because of sports have, make him strong. So for us, sports is very important. And, even we, as a person with disability, I think we are, in spite of those challenges, we need sport as a, medical, is a therapy. But what is really lacking, to make sure that sports for all, as I said, we need to look at those issues, those challenges that we are facing, social integration, because in some cultures, they are still, think that person with disability, they cannot practice. And also challenge of infrastructure, challenge of accessible, challenge of, to be included in society. Wherever those challenges will be removed, I think that we, person with disability, we can show that we are able, and also sports is really life, especially for persons with disabilities.
For those of us who like sport is life is kind of a fairly good motto, and for those who aren't into sports, they find us deeply confusing. So just before we could move on to the question and answers, is there anything that any of the panelists want to kind of bring in or touch on that's kind of come up over the last session, just before we move on to the questions? And the questions are quite wide ranging, so just on some of the issues we've already talked about.
I think we have a lot of great questions. It'd be great to jump in on those.
Okay, so the first question we actually have here is from Vera Kotov, who has a question regarding the Paralympics and its flag, and is asking if anyone knows the story of its creation or reasons for deciding on that symbol, and what, I suppose, the panelists' opinions are on it. Would they prefer Olympic rings? If I'm not mistaken, the Paralympic flag is the 3 kind of half C's, right?
Yes.
Okay, just for everyone's context, that it's kind of, I'm trying to mime it out, which is very useless, both in terms of illustrating it, but it is 3 half rings, sort of. So does anyone want to come in on that?
I can chime in on the history piece. I do know, just because of being involved with the founding group, Dr. Studward, and kind of knowing some of that history of the evolution of the flag and kind of how it has evolved at different stages early on. At one point there were 5 teguts, and then some of the games early on had that, and then it evolved into 3, and some of that had to do with the arrangements between and that's the current one. At one point it was teguts, it was a different 3. So it has evolved even in the recent years. And some of that has to do with the differentiation and how the Paralympic brand has wanting to have that brand and that empowerment there. And then there also is some of it's just contractual in terms of 2 different organizations and so forth. But there also are evolutions now you're seeing even since 2000 with the contract between the Olympic and the Paralympic. You're seeing now that the same organizing committee, that puts on the Olympic and Paralympics, and so you're seeing the 2 flags more together. There are several countries now that are combined, so you have Olympic and Paralympic committee organizations that are combined, and they have the logos, really side by side. So yeah, there has been an evolution of history, and different athletes, have different perspectives and views. And I think that one interesting aspect of this is, there's just, Olympians getting Paralympic tattoos or Paralympians getting Olympic tattoo, and so, or getting both, so you're kind of seeing this really interesting evolution of identity and empowerment. And, I think from I can just share my perspective, from a broader holistic view, I really value the Olympic movement and the Paralympic part fitting into that broader movement. So I really see the value of both symbols, the Olympic rings as it relates, but also the Paralympic symbol. So I really associate, with both. And so I really feel like and because they're together, I feel like it's important that we kind of celebrate and embrace, both. And I feel like if an athlete wants to have an Olympic tattoo or a Paralympic tattoo, or, like that is part of their identity and how they feel empowered through their experience in sport. But yeah, that's just some of my thoughts. And that's a little bit of the history, to share that.
It's really, really, really interesting. And again, re-emphasizing that, para is parallel or equivalent, and that's often something that gets missed, although I don't think anyone in our audience would have that misapprehension as to kind of the meaning of even the term. Does anyone else want to come in on kind of the flag and the symbolisms and what it means? I know Dominique.
Yeah.
Please.
I think as every athlete in the Paralympic, we should know, what the meaning of those 3 adjectives, the red, the green, and the blue one. So this, in a briefly, see, it is I think it's in Latin say I move. So it means that we Paralympian, we can excite and move. We can move and excite the world. So this is the meaning of those 3 adjectives. Yes, mean that we are moving and that we can also excite the world in para sport.
Again, really important. The next question that I have on my screen is kind of how we can advocate for Paralympics to allow kind of children with disabilities to participate and be recognised with their talent, without kind of comparison, and recognising kind of the uniqueness of their work and their way of performing different activities. And I suppose that also stretches to looking at inclusion of children more broadly in terms of sport and disability sport as well in particular. If anyone wants to come in and recognising that, we can alongside that, like girls as well have particular drop off, particularly in youth participation around the age of 12, so that inclusion of young people can stretch beyond. Anyone wants to come in on that question?
I think we spoke on it a little bit earlier, just in terms of the youth level and children participation and being able to engage in all lots of different ways and opportunities. But yeah, I completely believe that the advocacy piece needs to continue to happen. When we're looking at children's rights in sports, oftentimes children with disabilities are not a part of that conversation. And so I think the more that we are, when there are the meetings and policies being set on children and children's rights, I know, that's why it's amazing. I'll give a shout out to Amy Farkas and many others that have been so amazing at making sure that when we have these conversations on children's rights, that disability and children with disabilities are included. But when we're looking at the safeguarding, when we're looking at all these different elements of inclusion and protection of the rights of young people, we need to ensure that we are thinking about universal design, we're thinking about children with disabilities. Thank you.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in on that question? The next question I have on the question and answers, and I should say, if you want to ask a question live, do put up your hand, and someone from the CDLP will make sure you're able to access your microphone and turn on your microphone. Is from Nina Portalon, and Nina is a para karate athlete from Serbia and a member of the national team. And Nina says that at the recent European Championships, I noticed some new rules were added, which, although meant for good, are actually discriminatory. And the question Nina has is, how do you propose we as athletes and activists can advocate for changes starting from our national federation onto an international level? And what steps can I take? That's Nina, not me, to bring attention to this. And I know you've all been involved with advocacy at various levels, so.
Shall I go first? Okay. It's a question about advocacy and activism, so I thought maybe I will take it. So one of the things I believe while working on the issue that I work on is the creation of a collective, creation of, sort of finding allies across different professions. I mean, I have fantastic media friends who I have, found very helpful through these last few years. Friends who are lawyers who have agreed to fight pro bono. So I think the best thing is to sort of try and find who are the people who might help you. Who are your allies, if there is anyone else who's saying something similar. I'm not aware of the specific policies or change of rules that Nina is talking about. But in general, I can say that, trying to find your allies to strengthen, your point of view. And also, I think you can use media to help you, which I have done often. I mean, write in the media or sort of draw attention to this issue by speaking to a journalist friend that you might have or through someone, and just get one article out there. And we have the power of social media today, which we can use to sort of draw people's attention to this, tag all the important institutions which are who are there. And then at the end of the day, if you want to take legal recourse, you do have some form of, courts available for sport, which could be at the national level, could be your national courts. But if you're specifically talking about sports sector, then you have the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, I do understand, and I do think that it's quite an expensive affair to go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, having taken a couple of athletes to that court. I mean, even the initial court fee is quite something. So that wouldn't be my first step, definitely. You need enough support around you. But I think using social media or media to start with and trying to find your allies is a good step forward.
So I would like, first off, to apologize, and also I understand her frustration, Nina, frustration as an athlete. Again, this is also the question that we answer, how international decision and also laws affect, the participation of athletes. As my knowledge, I know that karate is not yet the Paralympic sports. And to be a Paralympic sport, I remember those laws, those bylaws, IPC bylaws saying that in order, a sport to be recognized as a Paralympic sport, it need to be practiced in 3 continents by 18 countries. So you can imagine those, even those international rules, as long as, they are not flexible. So as the activities, as the person who are working in disability activities, and also as as a athlete, I can really understand about we need to make sure that we can advocate so that, the laws can be, I feel flexible and not just, limit on, also make sure that all athletes can access. But as long as I know IPC and also those rules, international regulation, as long as they're not really abide for those rules, it will be difficult. For me, and also, as I said, in the International Paralympic Committee, it also depends on classification. For karate women or men, in order to practice, you can do karate with one leg or without arm or legs, but you need also perhaps to have sophisticated prosthesis. But those prostheses, when you are wearing a prosthesis, arm or leg, so these also can affect your classification. So I think those, you have to understand those kind of rules, classification. It also affects, the participation of athletes in some sports.
And I'll just add briefly about, again, on the advocacy points, just to build off of excellent comments and also from the technical side from the IPC as well, from what Dominic shared. I guess some examples to look at would be, how softball, was able to organize, how wrestling was able to organize, to kind of come back onto the programs. And I think sometimes, it is this mobilization, whether it is social media, whether it is, creating that collective network. Because if there's not a voice, if there's not that organization to put a sport on to the program or to make noise, if you will, then it's not happening, because it's not getting the attention, it's not being submitted forward, it's not getting the backing. So it really does take a lot of effort. I mean, I was peripherally involved with the softball and the wrestling, to kind of see. I wasn't intimately involved, but just seeing how they really did put their, network together and how they really mobilized. There is an interesting effort right now with sailing, actually. Sailing is putting together an effort to create on the Olympic program an inclusive event within sailing. And so that's kind of an interesting initiative right now that's happening globally within the sailing community, because right now sailing is not on the Paralympic program. And so there's an effort to bring sailing back into the Paralympics, but also to put this inclusive event into the Olympic Games, which would be the first ever inclusive event within the Olympic Games. So, it's really in this time, the time we've been talking about, like where we are now with athlete voice and organizing. It's just really a interesting, kind of an amazing time to look at how organizing is happening and advocacy is happening.
Really, really, really interesting stuff. And if anyone's interested, I tried to look up the costs of taking a case to the Committee of Arbitration in Sport, and it's in Swiss francs, and it is too much. Looking at people, the numbers are terrifyingly high. So I think finding your allies and starting to engage and allowing that mobilization of athletes themselves is so important. Virginie, do you want to come in?
I just wanted to add one thing. That when we were applying for Dutee Chand's case, I really had to work really hard to get the government of India support Ms. Chand, because, and at that time I was so involved in that case that I actually had to sort of ensure that the money is there, etc. Though I must say the lawyers we found and who were interested to represent her from Canada, Jim Bunting and Carlos Sayayo, both of them represented Dutee Chand pro bono, which was huge, which was great. But I remember the initial court fee was 1,000 Swiss francs. It was just the initial court fee, and then you were supposed to pay an arbitration fee, etc., etc. We got waived a lot of it because we were a completely pro bono team, but there were supporting costs of getting people to Switzerland to testify. So we got some support from the government of India, but I do remember then, Maria, that it was 1,000 Swiss francs, which to start with, Dutee Chand wouldn't have been able to afford in those days. Now she can, but in those days she couldn't have been.
Just incredible amounts of money. And I suppose when we talk about access to justice more broadly, we often raise this as an issue, but this is particularly when people also often take financial hits to engage with sport. It's just so inaccessible. And again, find your allies is clearly the only way, and find the pro bono lawyers. So I'm just looking to see, I'm trying to figure out what other questions we haven't answered. We have one question from Moses in Uganda, and it's been somewhat answered in the chat, but I think it's probably a good idea to address it more broadly, which is the idea that the question is if there's hard of hearing persons engaged in sporting activities, and that in Uganda a lot of the focus is put on like physically disabled people when it comes to sport. And I know Dominique and Eli have both somewhat answered that already in the chat, but I thought it might be good to bring it out and to actually have a discussion about like other forms of sport and where the focus is, like particularly like I'm thinking of like deaf sports and blind sport, but also looking at like Special Olympics and what you guys think of that. And I suppose also ensuring that we don't just focus on like specifically like elite para track athletes, or so if you guys want to come in on that a bit more, so everyone can hear.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share just more broadly on the conversation regarding kind of deaf sport internationally, and also Special Olympics, because we kind of worked across the board, particularly on the CRPD Article 30.5, to engage all the stakeholders and really looking at where the evolution has been with Paralympics, but also with deaf sport and Special Olympics as well. I mean, deaf sport is amazing, and they're having the World Games coming up in 2022, and just sometimes it's sort of lost a little bit, and unfortunately, with the amount of investment that's been coming into the Paralympics, and also with Special Olympics having the platform that it has for intellectual disabilities, deaf athletes can compete in many different settings, as we've talked about, but for deaf sport, it's the earliest disability sport organization, and the history there of a deaf and disability culture has created this amazing event. But in terms of how it has it's recognized in the same status actually as an affiliate with the IOC. So Special Olympics, Deaf Olympics, and Paralympics all are in the same status with the IOC. Although, the IPC and the IOC have this long-term contract, the Special Olympics has arrangements, and then deaf sport also has arrangements. But in terms of looking at deaf sport, and even my experience with, the deaf federations, international federations, and also national, I think there's still a sense that they're not on the same level. Like if unfortunately, we don't want to get into these hierarchies, and we want to kind of create opportunity for all. But, that's one of the challenges, that there are these kind of hierarchies. And sometimes I often say the deaf sport is kind of, lost sometimes. It's sometimes not able to get into that same level of recognition. And that's really frustrating, and trying to think strategically about how to bring more attention to deaf sport. And so, there was just some great, not only on sport, but also broader disability rights. If you look at the Committee on Disability that's looking at the convention, there's very little representation of deaf members. And so this is a broader issue, not just in sport. And then in terms of the Special Olympics, just briefly, for persons with intellectual disabilities, that has been an amazing movement. Special Olympics does have sort of competition there, but also more participation focused. I've had the pleasure of being at many of the Special Olympics World Games over the last several, the last probably 10, 15 years. But also the emphasis that Special Olympics does have on the inclusion movement and unified sports. I think that's very powerful, not only for Special Olympics, but for all sport, to think about opportunities for athletes with and without disabilities. And so I feel that they've done a really great, job to push that movement. And I do know now that there's more collaboration happening between all the disability groups. I mean, many of us have argued there needs to be more, and I think that's really important to kind of break down those silos and break down these hierarchies. Is how can we create more of a unified, collective movement? That's a little bit that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Dominique, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just, I think when you're working with those international federations, so you need to know sometime, it's a business, and also they have also, I think that priorities depend on the mission and the vision. For instance, we need to know that Paralympic is that's why it's a parallel to Olympics. It's like Olympics. So they're always focused on elites, athletes, when it's coming to competition. But when you go to look to Special Olympic, it's just, leisure sports. So, the philosophy behind, the two, they are somehow, different. So we need to know. I believe Olympic, I think that this is for artists. So there's always philosophy behind. So when it comes for IPC, it's really, I think that is elite athletes. Compared to Special Olympics, just leisure, and also depend on which category of person they are included. For instance, Special Olympics is for those who have mental and also intellectual disability. But really, I understand as someone working in disability activities, someone in sports, I need to know. I can just recommend for those international. We are now, I think that, look, we person with disability, we always, complain that we have been left, or I think we are not, we are not included in all sports or on all type of life in normal. So why, especially those international federations like IPC, cannot even include other sports? So if we are fighting for, no one can be left behind. So why I think that those international should be also, I think that, no leave one behind.
Nothing about us that is no one left behind. So we've just a couple of questions left. We've a question from Ishita here, and she just says there are Paralympics, Special Olympics, Ambi-Olympics, but do you think that people with disabilities can take it as a career and earn a decent living out of it, like players at the Olympics or I suppose other sports players? And isn't there a vast difference, at least in our mind, which would make Olympic sports where the whole world would be spectators, and in the case of Paralympics, there are fewer spectators or fan followers. And I suppose we've talked about like London 2020 or 2020, 21 years on the brain, London 2012 being a turning point for people in other sessions. So if anyone wants to come in on those particular issues.
Yeah, no, I'd love to just comment briefly. There is this momentum. There's more and more sponsors. There's more and more career opportunities. There's the professionalization of disability sport, adaptive sport. So you are seeing more opportunities at the athlete level for careers, but also in terms of the future sport managers, seeing adaptive Paralympic sport, Special Olympics, deaf sport as platforms that they can have a life and a career in. And so I think that is part of what we're seeing in this evolution of sport, particularly around persons with disabilities. It's really amazing to see. And part of it's this, the Paralympic campaign, the 15%, to kind of help to make the connection that this is not just a disability movement, but this is a human movement, and this relates to everybody in the world. And so I think that kind of connection, and that's also what Special Olympics is doing as well, is helping to make this connection to the fact that this is about all of us, and that it's important that we pay attention, and not only at the elite level, but at the grassroots, at the youth levels. But I from a kind of a research and advocacy standpoint, we really have seen kind of a growth, incremental. It's not where it needs to be, but there's definitely more and more, the investments, the sponsors, the careers, which is definitely a great, point of progress.
Yeah, I think also I would like to add, it depends, as they say, Paralympic is really especially for elites sports, and also it depends on country. There are countries where they are no longer, I think that Olympic and the Paralympic athletes. So what the country is looking is, I think is especially when we are participating to international Olympic game and also Paralympic. Those are somehow political games. So it depends on the recognition of the country. There are some countries where you get a medal in the Paralympic, in the Olympics, so they are always treated in equal. I think that what you gain when you have a medal in the Olympic and the Paralympic, they are the same. So I know there are some countries, and also even athletes who gain money when for them, Paralympic, to be a Paralympian, to be an athlete in Paralympic, it's also a sort of money, to gain money. So it depends. But as I say, it depends on country and the political or will of the government, especially like in my country also, there are no longer difference between, an athlete from Olympic and the Paralympic. They can, whatever you are bringing to country, so you'll be treated the same as others.
Aoisin, I think you wanted to come in that as well.
I just, I'm not very familiar to disability sport. I wish I had done more. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because you were talking about this growth and more investment coming into disability sport, which is obviously positive. But having had the pandemic in the last 1.5 years, and how we have noticed that in women's sports case, there has been a reduction of funding, and in women's sport, teams are really struggling to have their leagues. And obviously the question that Ishita asks about, spectators being there, it's all sort of, in a state of, flux. We don't really know when we are going to get back this whole, the full stadium that we used to have in any case in sort of say, English Premier League football. So how in these contexts, in the context of the pandemic, how things have changed, I wonder. I mean, I am, as far as investment for disability sport is concerned, as far as this whole progress that you were talking about in people's, in the sport fans interest in disability sport, has it also been sort of halted by this pandemic, as we see in case of one, women's sport, and also in recreational and sport, in community level sport, there is a huge sort of problem, lack of funds, lack of programs, and it's a huge struggle at this point.
Yeah, I think there have been challenges, and I think it is in the same way for all of sport to sort of, as we're coming back. I think that one point to think about, or it's kind of been interesting to experience over the last 18 months, has been just the recognition of difference and disability and how we adapt and how we are resilient and how we kind of recognize that, we can work in different ways. People with disabilities have been asking for, being able to work from home and to adapt in different ways for years. And so now kind of this translation of the experience, I think it has some, I'm not to say it's been normalized per se, but I think there's been some awareness that helps to have these conversations, but in terms of the way things have been halted, the economies and how it's coming back. But perhaps this is an opportunity now to at least have these conversations about the fact that we have had these 18 months and all of us have experienced these challenges. And so how does that then translate into our new reality? But that's a great question.
I think there's also quite a lot there when we talk about like the need for spectators. Like spectators have to be given the chance to watch the sport, right? Like part of the reason why London 2012 was incredible was because Channel 4 wanted to be really competitive in ensuring that they got just as much coverage out of the Olympics, or the like British Olympics summer as the BBC did for broadcasting the Olympics. So they put a huge amount behind the Paralympics, and it wasn't always great, but it did at the very least mean that like everyone in London, it was really exciting. It was really prevalent. It was really visible there. I think we're also seeing that in women's sport. In Ireland right now, we have this aim that it was by 2020, it was 20 by 20. And by 2020, 20% of our sports coverage had to be women's sports. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it has meant that people are following women's sports much more than they ever previously had been. And you actually
give the mental health conversation too. I mean, that's sparked that awareness of why mental health is so important. I mean, this last year has been all about mental health. So
yeah, and to actually create the space for those conversations has been huge in allowing that to happen in more mainstream spaces, and it'll allow us to build. We have one last question, which is from Candice Cable, and it is not a quick question, but I'm very curious to see what you guys come up with. I'm also going to take the liberties of extending it to sexism and patriarchy as well at that same time. So persons with disabilities have been subject to ableism and been discriminated against in many ways and in the cultures of the world. And how can sport contribute to this dismantling of ableism? But I'm also going to throw in sexism there as well, just because. Who wants to come in?
Yeah, I guess for me, I just wanted to bring up that it's also, maybe we can have an interactive, but for me it's ableism, but it's also internalized ableism. So I just want us to, when we talk about ableism, we also need to talk about internalized ableism. We need to talk about internalized sexism, internalized racism. We need to really think about how, populations that have been marginalized and discriminated against, accept and normalize these stereotypes and these stigmas. And how do we begin to challenge that? And how do we think differently about the broader system of what does inclusion mean? And how do we create, really authentic and valuing systems, not only in sport, but in other aspects of society. And so I guess to me, sport is a great platform, but sport is there and it can be used in really positive, proactive ways, but it also can be utilized in destructive and ways that are really hard, and challenging ways and ways that, limit people's opportunities. And so I think part of sport and play is how it's the intentionality of how it is actually constructed. And so I think that's the connection between sport and ableism and internalized ableism. But I think it has this amazing potential, and if it can be used to address ableism and internalized ableism, and we need to push that. We need to make it happen.
Shall I go next? Or Dominic, you want to go first?
Go.
So, the point, because Maria added sexism and, I thought I'll just get in there with two stories and not really, anecdotes. So when I was young and I was, sport wasn't the usual choice for me, though I ended up being a badminton player. So I was sent for to a dance school, and I was abused there. And so I felt I was sexually abused by my dance teacher's husband. And I felt that I need to sort of have a more ungendered kind of persona that's going to make me feel more secure in a world where, where young girls are not really safe. And I said, I want to choose sport. So I came into sport because I felt that being an athlete would give me a kind of an ungendered identity. I used to cut my hair really short at that point, and then had, used to wear shorts all the time and pretend as if I was almost, pretended to be a boy at times, and would really love it when people would get confused. So I felt that was something that was going to protect me from the male gaze that I experienced so early in my life. And also the experience wasn't really, obviously the experience wasn't something that I was coping with well. And I had some of the athletes I've spoken to and very early in my career who were also sort of struggling at the time of adolescence with the physical changes and the changes that they were noticing not happening to them. For example, I have had an athlete who talked about not menstruating, whereas all other friends are menstruating, and her breasts were not developing, whereas all other girls she had in her school, they had their breasts developing, and those kind of anxieties that she was going through. And she said that the moment I started running, I felt that I was more accepted, because it's okay to be a girl athlete and be flat-chested. It's okay to be a girl athlete and look slightly boyish. So, so in both of our cases, we came to sport because we felt sport would give us that freedom, where our body doesn't necessarily need to look a certain kind. But eventually, at a later stage, experiences have been different. At the high performance stage, experiences have been different, where as you see in most of the athletes' cases that I work with, women with high testosterone, their experiences are so different. So sport had that kind of scope, that kind of prospect to be this wonderful space where everyone is accepted the way they are. But somehow high performance sport, thanks to the competition rules, regulations, strict if this is how it should be, strict binary model, etc., hasn't been as welcoming as we would have wanted it to be. So I just wanted to add that today.
So I will answer your question by, I'm always believe on ability. That's why I'm always fight for against some terminology. When you calling me like, I'm disabled. Disabled mean I'm able person, but I am able, and also I always fight also, even though the new terminology according to UNCLPD disability. Disability is meaning of lack of ability. But me as a sportsman, we can say that we have ability. Like for instance, I used to play standing volleyball when I have still 2 legs. But when I lost my leg, we Paralympian, we changed, the standing volleyball to sitting volleyball. So this show, that we have ability. We have ability to change even the word in our words. So for me, I think that, even we need to fight for those terminology because everyone has ability, especially we person with ability. We can change the words if we are included, if there is a full participation, I think that they remove all barriers. Disability means, barriers. As long as the society, they cannot, give us the opportunity to enjoy the equal opportunity, the equal right as other people by removing all barriers, accessibility, I think that everything. So I think that they will still look at as person who are not able, but we are able and we have ability to change the world.
And I think the disability, it's great, Dominic. To me, disability is how do you focus on the ability? How do you focus on sport? How do you focus on, all that you're doing? But to me, also disability in my own, and I think the movement as it grows, disability is a pride. There is an aspect of disability pride and disability rights, and how do we, kind of see disability and how do we educate around disability that even through sport, that it's something that we really are, want to share in that success and that pride with the movement, with our families, with our communities. So I don't know. To me, I think how do we combine that, focusing on the ability, focusing on the sport, and helping see that disability is an empowering word. It's an empowering framework, not one that means something that's limited or something. So that's something that I just was inspired, Dominic, by your comments and wanted to follow yours.
In a way, decolonize sport, sort of redefine these, the way sport has been governed, structured, the way sport has been structured, sort of completely decolonize that. It's a process, and I believe we are working towards it. Many of us are, and there are some results that we do see. Maybe not, huge, something really big, but we do see on and off as we walk towards that some changes, which are also important.
As sport at its best is often just people using their bodies, whatever their bodies might look like, in the most innovative and exciting and challenging ways. That's often very much set by their own parameters. And I think the more we engage with that is, I suppose, the real idea and the real focus, and create more of egalitarian and a more equal idea of how that's valued. We can, I suppose, really change things. And the more we focus on that, the better sport will be, at least in my opinion. I'm conscious we have come to the end of our time. We have been talking for 2 hours and our panelists need rest. I am so very, very grateful to all of you and for our participants for their excellent questions as well. To be able to have this conversation, which I have been looking forward to for about 2.5 years. So to finally be able to have it and have such a wonderful conversation with so many really incredible perspectives and valuable insights has been just really humbling for me. So I'm very grateful to
talk anytime. We can have a coffee next week, or we're happy to continue anytime.
Absolutely. This is where we're really missing the pub for summer school.
Yeah. I wish it was in person and we could continue with this discussion, and also with the participants. We could have just walked into an Irish pub and had this conversation go on. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this, Mariam.
Thank you guys so much. We will get to the pub eventually.
Thank you.